You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans, the founder of War on the Rocks, and I'm sitting here with Michael Kofman, who you all know very well and needs no introduction. I think this is the longest we've gone without recording an episode since the war started.
Yeah, we definitely heard about it.
Sorry to those who are waiting, but we're here. We got a long episode to record. A lot has happened. I think it might be good to start with the Ukrainian offensive. Has it started? Hasn't it started? There seems to be some basic disagreement about this.
Sure, and a lot of focus on when it'll happen. Look, you can look at it two ways. I mean, it's obvious that the main offense of the operation people are expecting, the one with units specifically set aside for it, has not begun yet, all right? In terms of things people like to call doctrinally shaping operations or sort of the maybe preparatory phase or sort of things that set the conditions for the offensive, from my point of view, that started a few weeks ago. And I think the activities that involves is a host of Ukrainian troop movements and sort of localized probing attacks along the front, a localized counterattack at Bakhmut, which we can discuss a bit later, but I think was in part meant to fix Russian forces there, a series of strikes against Russian logistics and C2, including those that involved the newly acquired Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles provided by the UK. And this most recent diversionary operation, the cross-border raid into Belgorod, which I think is also meant to distract Russian attention and try to get them to consume their resources. So I think you're seeing a host of activities, the net sum of which is that Ukraine is seizing the initiative back for the first time since probably around December. There's quite a bit going on in terms of strikes and trying to set the conditions, sabotage in Russia, strikes that took place before against facilities in Crimea. And on the whole, it's fair to say that, we're probably in the very early phases of the offensive operation, understanding that none of the main efforts have yet begun. And now I think it's also fair to say that based on the timing, there's not going to be a spring offensive, it's going to be a summer offensive operation. Secondarily, that Ukraine has had the time to acquire all the equipment promised back in January and absorb it. So none of that equipment will be backfilled. That was my initial hypothesis, if you remember, back in January, thinking that Ukrainian forces might advance as soon as March, April. And that's clearly not the case and not happening. And some folks have asked, well, why has the offensive not taken place yet? Which I find somewhat mystifying. I mean, first, it'll take place when it does. It's Ukrainian General Staff's decision on when to run it. I think there can be a host of reasons, from weather as a mitigating effect to setting preparations in place to still having to generate additional forces and recovering after Russia's winter offensive. There can be all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, I think people understand this intellectually, but they often treat it too much like this is some sort of spectator sport playing out on Twitter for their engagement.
Yeah, it's particularly problematic for the media, I think, because of the content drill, and they need to have something.
Yeah, we've talked about it a lot already, but let's talk about as you've, I think, have fairly assisted, the failed Russian offensive and where that left Russian forces and the disposition of Russian forces at its end.
So I think that the most critical battles of the Russian winter offensive were the ones spanning from Vuhledar to Marinka, Avdiivka, and up by Kreminna and also Bilohorivka. I think it spent a lot of Russian military power, exhausted Russian forces, and now it's sort of an open question mark as to the state of the Russian military, as starting as far back as April, they began to shift to a defensive posture in anticipation of the Ukraine offensive. The only battle that had been ongoing really at that time was Bakhmut, and we can discuss Bakhmut a bit separately. But yeah, it's fair to say that the Russian winter offensive had given Ukraine an opportunity, right? Without which it might have been a lot harder for them to prosecute the operation everybody's anticipating. Now, the winter offensive tells us a few things. It tells us that only a small percentage of the Russian military was capable of offensive military operations. This was typically the airborne naval infantry, and casualties among them will prove significant in the upcoming operation rather than whatever happened to Wagner. Wagner forces were typically never used for defense and have never been seen as particularly being viable in that mission. Secondarily, that the Russian military at this stage has had such a degradation of quality that they're not really capable of large-scale combat operations. And that might be why they attempted advances along many different axes rather than a major offensive operation, because it just doesn't look like they have the capacity to employ forces at the scale they did at the beginning of the war. And that can be for all sorts of reasons. Most likely, from my point of view, it's quality, right? You can replace quantity, but you can't replace quality of forces. And then there's outstanding questions about what are Russian artillery ammunition reserves. It looks like they're increasing production, but they probably have to ration. And on the whole, it's not clear how much of an advantage Ukraine will have in the upcoming operation. But my general sense is that the winter offensive failed. I early on suggested it was going to be doomed to failure, just basically the way it was going. And a lot of folks were even trying to figure out why they weren't seeing the real Russian offensive yet, because it was so lackluster.
This brings us to Bakhmut. It seemed like Russian forces were poised to take much of the city, and then there was this big open fallout between Prigozhin and the formal Russian armed forces. Could you walk us through the sort of, let's say, like the last month of what happened in Bakhmut?
Okay, so in the last month of that battle, it looked like Wagner, backed by Russian forces, was pressing the Ukrainian military slowly out of the city, okay? They had already cut some of the main supply routes. They were working on sort of the very last parts or quadrants. Then there was a major dispute. Prigozhin began making public videos and statements and even press releases, essentially saying that he was being denied artillery ammunition, that he was being intentionally sabotaged by the Ministry of Defense, and that he was going to order Wagner to withdraw from Bakhmut by May 10th, right? And these theatrics were sort of confounding. I don't know for a fact what happened, but my sense of it is that he was being intentionally sabotaged. Colonel General, who was in charge of logistics and providing supplies to the Russian armed forces, he clearly had a good connection with Prigozhin, and he was removed by the Russian military, and then very quickly he was found kind of in Wagner uniform. I think that probably Prigozhin sensed that he was being sabotaged because the winter offensive had failed. And so the Russian military, seeing Wagner as their competitor, didn't want them to succeed and want them to lose as much manpower as possible in the fight for Bakhmut, which makes it somewhat ironic because it means that if you believe that, then it suggests that both the Ukrainian military strategies and the Russian military strategies was actually to try to exhaust Wagner in Bakhmut, which perhaps is a separate conversation, but it's just a fascinating discussion of its own accord. And so Prigozhin basically saw that he was being sabotaged. He wasn't going to be able to take Bakhmut by May 9th and decided to engage in these theatrics to blame the Russian military. I think also he might have feared that they were going to steal the victory from him like they tried to do at Soledar, which is Russian regular units were en route and showing up at Bakhmut, and he might have thought that the military was going to try to supplant his forces and then claim credit for the battle. All right. Ultimately, the proposition that he could just withdraw his forces on his own, I found somewhat ludicrous. Wagner is not nearly as independent as he portrays it to be.
Let's dig into that a little bit. I think they are not independent in terms of their ability to wage war at the front, but whether they're fighting or not, don't you think they might have some independence there?
I think they're ultimately part of the regional grouping of forces on that front. I don't think they have their own mobility and capacity to just come and go as they please. I'm skeptical of that. I think that Prigozhin's statements probably ultimately got Putin to intervene. That's the way it looks. Surovikin, who's another contact of his, got appointed as essentially his liaison, and he seemed to have largely gotten his way. In retrospect, just looking at a lot of other anecdotal reporting, I'm skeptical that Wagner had such terrible problems with artillery ammunition. Both Ukrainians complained about a disadvantage there, and other Russian forces complained about having a relative disadvantage in artillery ammunition. So it actually looked like Wagner was doing okay. But here's my sense of it. After this, the way the battle plays out is that Wagner forces ultimately do press the Ukrainian military out of the remaining parts of Bakhmut. Bakhmut essentially falls, and it's largely destroyed as a city. The Ukrainian military then launches a localized counterattack with those units that had already been deployed, 3rd Assault Brigade being one of the ones in the lead. At this stage, the flanks of Bakhmut, these are kind of largely open fields. The defensive lines there are very weak. There's sort of nothing compared to the Russian entrenchments along the front, let's say in the south. And they're being held by some of the worst when we look at Russian units, largely mobilized regiments or units like 72nd Brigade, and they buckle pretty quickly. And so Ukrainian forces are able to make several square kilometers in terms of advances on the flanks of Bakhmut, and they're able to relieve the pressure. But as the battle unfolds, what's happening over the course of about a week and a half is that they're pushing back the regular Russian units on the flanks, while Wagner is still making progress in the city itself and pushing the Ukrainian military out of the western part of the city. I think people were probably a bit overly optimistic on what Syrskyi's announced defensive operation could achieve. I'm not fully sure what its goal was. It might have been just, as he said it, a defensive operation to enable them to withdraw, or an attempt to counterattack and take advantage of the infighting between Wagner and Russian forces, right? There was a lull in the momentum, and it looked like a good opportunity for Ukrainians to take terrain back. Or it could be just to set the conditions for a larger offensive operation later on. I don't have the best answer here, but I'm just saying that it looked like they got back some square kilometers, but it also did not make significant progress either in terms of changing the overall picture in Bakhmut.
Mike, I want to take a quick break from our discussion. Can you talk about your experience with the Russian contingency, our members-only show, one of our members-only shows, and how it's been for you so far, and how much you've enjoyed it, or where you plan to take the show, etc.?
Okay, so the honest answer is I've enjoyed it, although I don't feel I'm naturally like a podcaster. I never thought of myself in that way, right, professionally. So my sense of it is that I've used it as an opportunity, a structural opportunity, to talk to some of the best people who are working on Russia, on European security, who are historians in the field. I've had a great time sometimes just using it as a Q&A, and we've tried starting an episode and just asking people online to submit questions, and we've gotten 80 questions plus within 30 minutes of an episode that we're just trying to do. So to me, the experience has been pretty positive. I'm going to try to keep it more structured in the sense of having specific people that I want to talk to as the show evolves and be able to do deep dives. But that said, as always, sometimes for those who are regular listeners, just to be clear, sometimes if you don't see an episode come out one week, it's often because I'm traveling, but I may be taping a really good episode with somebody abroad that I've come to see in person.
And you can become a member and listen to Mike's show, The Russia Contingency, at warntherocks.com/membership. It's actually not that expensive. It's only $7.50 a month or $75 a year. Prices will go up again later this year, so you should act soon. And now back to our conversation. All right, now let's zoom out a little bit and look at Russian force structure and force availability at the end of the Russian offensive. Russia's gone through another wave of mobilization since the offensive started, rather. Where does this leave the Russian force in terms of manpower and also where they're deployed along the Eastern Front?
Actually, I think the fascinating thing is that the Russian military has not conducted a mobilization in practice.
I didn't mean mobilization. I mean their annual call-up.
Two things have happened since then. The first is they had launched a major national campaign, a recruitment drive, and it's been ongoing since the winter to try to address their manpower issues. The main problem with manpower is, first, that they need a way to replace casualties. Second, they need to be able to rotate units. Otherwise, the units on the line eventually get exhausted and they lose all combat potential. And they need a way to generate additional forces because if they don't, they'll just be depleted over time. It's not just about casualty replacement. To have offensive potential, they need more forces. That's one of the biggest issues that they had in the winter offensive. They'd barely stabilized the Russian military. That force had absorbed replacements for the losses they'd suffered over the past year, and also for the fact that they started the war at peacetime strength, which meant they were probably missing up to 30% of the manpower available in the ground force. And I think a lot of folks don't realize that how quickly those 300,000 people were just absorbed. So the Russian military still has structural manpower problems this year. And they're trying to do everything they can without enacting a second mobilization to fix them, but I don't think they will be able to. My assumption is that this campaign won't generate enough people and that they're waiting to see what's going to happen in the Ukraine offensive. But ultimately, they may have to conduct another mobilization, let's say towards the fall again, in order to try to manage what is a structural problem.
All right, now let's go back to the Ukrainian picture. As we've discussed previously in this episode, and as you've discussed in the Russia contingency and in other fora, Ukraine has these fully equipped brigades with Western equipment ready to be used in this offensive. What are you seeing in terms of, beyond the shaping operations that we already discussed, and we'll get to this weird incursion into Russia later, what are you seeing in terms of how you think these brigades are going to be used and where?
We don't actually know the total size of the force Ukraine has assembled for this, but my general sense is that is 9 brigades which have been equipped and trained by Western countries, of which a lot of them are actually motorized, not mechanized, to be perfectly honest.
For our listeners who don't know the difference, explain that.
Okay, so the motorized brigades consist primarily of wheeled armored vehicles, whereas the mechanized brigades consist primarily of tracked armored fighting vehicles, things like infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, and tanks. Whereas the motorized ones, for example, there are several brigades that are just Max Pros, if you know what that is, or various sort of a combination of ambush protected or armored vehicles, but they're pretty light and they're wheeled. And yes, there is a difference once you go off roads as to whether or not you have a wheeled or tracked vehicle. So if we look at the units that they have available, supposedly they have 3 additional brigades along that force. They have some number of brigades that are being generated from the rest of the Ukrainian military that probably have not been in the fighting over the course of the winter. And they have brigades that kind of are referred to as the offensive guard that are being generated by the Ministry of Interior. And these, I think, will mostly consist of National Guard units. All right. This force, in some respect, it consists of units that have been set aside from the regular military, but the main brigades that have been trained by the West are generally mobilized personnel who are newly trained. And it's essentially a test of a proof of concept, right? That with Western equipment and Western training and Western ammunition provided, Ukraine can break through Russian lines at this stage of the war and ideally engage in a more efficient way of warfare that's not so heavily driven by attrition and fires, but rather by combined arms maneuver. And we'll see if that's the case. Now, my sense is that the Ukrainian military is obviously in much better shape than the Russian military. But the Ukrainian military's task is much more difficult. Offense is more difficult than defense in land warfare. And it's not clear if they have all the enablers and the other components the capabilities they would need in order to break through Russian defensive lines with ease. So I'm not going to make any predictions on the score because, as I've said before, these are actually 2 different militaries at this point. And the campaign is not going to look like the way Kherson or Kharkiv did. I think it'll probably be closer to Kherson, but I don't know that necessarily to be true. And the same thing goes on the Russian side. These defensive lines, these entrenchments, and there are multiple lines in the south, fewer in the east from Svatova Crimea, to be honest, but they've not been seriously tested. They're manned by mobilized personnel. They're reserve lines. Probably the main linchpin of those lines will be the Russian airborne or better trained units. So it remains to be seen how they will fare.
And let's talk a little bit. You alluded to Storm Shadow earlier. First, tell our listeners what that is and why you think it might or might not be some sort of a difference maker.
Storm Shadow or Scalp EG, I think it's probably going to be, I think it's a British-French equipment program. So this is a air-launched cruise missile that's kind of a lower observation missile, I think closest to the U.S. JASSM, for those who are familiar with that. And if you're not, that's okay. The reason folks think it might be significant is because it gives the Ukrainian Air Force the ability to strike at standoff range, perhaps 200 kilometers or more, well behind Russian lines, with a weapon that is not easy to intercept, that carries a sizable warhead, sizable payload, can penetrate bunkers or fortified locations, and in many ways, it is comparable to the kind of capability you might get from having ATACMS missiles. It's not the same thing, but it can deliver similar effects. And it'll, again, put to the test the proposition that if Ukraine had, let's say, 50 or 100 Storm Shadows or something like that, I don't know how many the UK gave it.
Where are they going to be launched from is my question. I haven't read that much about this, so this is a genuine question. They're air launched, so they need to be launched from specific aircraft.
Yeah, sure. So I'm guessing probably Su-24s or something sizable that can carry multiple such missiles. I doubt they're launching them off MiG-29s, but I don't know for a fact what they're using as the delivery platform. I assume it's something like a Su-24, and I'm also assuming that they're launching them against fixed infrastructure, so they punch in the coordinates, the strike coordinates in advance. And then how many they have, I don't know, because I don't think UK had that many in general in their inventory, so I can't imagine they gave a tremendous amount. But that being said, it will help reveal if Ukraine has a capability like this, how much of a difference would it make in the war?
It's interesting. It can pose certain operational dilemmas for Russia in terms of, when an aircraft pops up somewhere in Ukraine, they might not have to worry about it as much. But if one pops up with one of these missiles, then they have to worry about it more and then do something about it, which then creates dilemmas and trade-offs for Russia, how Russia uses its own air power over Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that one thing that this will definitely help illustrate is to what extent the challenge of striking Russian logistics and command posts is simply one of range. I don't think it is. Because I think since HIMARS were introduced, the Russian military didn't just move all these points further back, but it hardened them. It learned to create decoys. It learned not to concentrate ammunition and what have you at locations that are easy to find, fix, and target. And so this will kind of help reveal whether or not that's true, and also will help reveal to what extent the Russian military still very lazily kind of adapts to a capability that's introduced a month or two after it's introduced, or to what extent they've adapted in advance, right? And of course, we're going to see strikes, but we're not going to see necessarily the same effects that we saw when HIMARS was first introduced in late June of last year.
Now let's talk about the F-16. President Biden announced that Ukraine would be getting some F-16s. They're probably not going to be U.S. F-16s. They're going to be European, and the Europeans are probably going to be responsible for the training as well. What do you make of this? I have my own thoughts on this that you probably have seen, but what do you make of this?
Big picture, I think that Ukraine ultimately needs to transition off of Soviet-type platforms onto some kind of Western platform that they can maintain, that there are enough of variants out there, and that Europeans can support them in having this capability. So from the standpoint of kind of long-term transition, I think it makes sense. I thought it was always kind of inevitable, and it was just a question of when and what they would get, whether it's F-16 or a friend of the podcast, Justin Brong, had advocated also strongly for the Saab Gripen as a suitable platform. Regarding the F-16 itself, first, I don't think that this aircraft is going to make much of a difference this year, and I'll be surprised if we'll see it in the war.
Or next year.
Next year, based on what I've heard. Second, it really depends what aircraft they get. There are many different blocks and variations, and it varies significantly. A lot also hinges on what kind of upgrades and capabilities countries provide Ukraine with F-16. For example, it's not clear if Ukraine will get access to the most capable variants of the AIM-120CD to be able to take on the Russian Air Force. It's not clear if they'll get radar upgrades or other systems that they might want. And ultimately, I think it'll give their Air Force a greater role, but I don't see them being able to establish anything like air superiority. I'm even skeptical about localized air superiority with several handfuls of F-16s. I'm sorry. And I've had these conversations with Ukrainian colleagues, and the F-16 may be able to perform much better, let's say, seed missions and suppress Russian air defense. But the question always goes in the service of what?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a long-term play, and I'm not against it. People jumped on me, all over me on Twitter for saying that I didn't think they were going to be especially useful to Ukraine, and I stand by that, actually. And I think there's two problems here. Maintenance is going to be very tough. These aircraft require something like, I don't know, somewhere between 15 and 20 hours of maintenance for each hour it spends in the air. And the bigger problem that I think people are talking less about is this is a multi-role fighter. And in the US and in our European allies, pilots get, mission-specific kind of training. They don't just learn to fly the F-16 and they can do suppression of enemy air defense, air superiority, and all the rest. They get certified for these specific kinds of mission sets. And that's where I think there's going to be the big problem in how they're eventually used. As for when they're going to be used, I don't know. Supposedly, the Netherlands and Denmark are going to be leading the training, which leads me to believe that they're going to get older Danish and Dutch F-16s. And I'm not against it. I think the real value it provides Ukraine is it locks them into a sort of U.S.-supplied system for whenever the war ends. So this is, to me, and Adrian pointed this out on Twitter, my friend Adrian, that this is really about the next 5 to 10 years. This is not about the next year and a half.
I think that's absolutely right. I want to add a few more points. First, I've seen out there online people saying that 2 Ukrainian pilots had learned to fly the F-16 in something like 4 months or less. Yeah, if all you want to do is fly it and do nothing else with it, and have
Well, they might even be able to do something with it. Like as soon as someone sees an F-16 in the sky on OSINT, they're going to be like, "See, they're useful." Or as soon as they do, but it's like you have to look at the bigger picture beyond the tactical.
yeah, I just want to set expectations that it doesn't mean the Ukrainian Air Force will be able to effectively use F-16s in some kind of missions, probably even this year. I completely agree with you. This is a long-term, multi-year program. I don't know what impact they're going to really make on the battlefield. Some folks think that they'll help keep the Russian Air Force further at bay if the Russian Air Force knows that Ukraine has F-16s on patrol. Okay, fine. I think that's possible, and we'll see if that's really true next year, but it depends what they get, what kind of capabilities are provided with them, how many, and a lot of challenges with operating F-16. I am no expert on F-16. I have pursued a very non-rigorous approach of asking F-16 pilots and units that have operated F-16s what they think, okay? And based on some of their opinions, which can vary, my impression is that this is going to be a lot more difficult than it looks, and certainly than the way it reads to folks on Twitter.
Now, let's talk a little bit about this weird incursion into Russia by at least a force that seems predominantly made up of Russians who may or may not be basically neo-Nazis or far-right nationalists of a very peculiar brand.
Sure. So,
what happened here?
Well, okay, and I think we should be clear. There's still a fair amount of kind of fog of war of this whole operation, but I think that this looks like a much larger and spectacular follow-up to an operation earlier in the spring in Bryansk, a little cross-border raid by a couple of these sort of Russian Legion fighters. And to me, I don't know this to be true, but to me, these look like operations probably conducted with a sponsorship and organization of Ukrainian intelligence. Most best guess is GOR military intelligence. But my impression is that there's been a lot of back and forth shelling from the Kharkiv and Belgorod region. Outside of Belgorod, at the border, there was an attack. The attack was supported probably by Ukrainian forces because it looked like they had an artillery barrage and at least a tank with them to break through the initial lines. There's just Russian border guards essentially defending, but it didn't look like the border was particularly well or heavily defended. And then having made the initial breakthrough, whatever forces were involved then withdrew, and 2 units of this Russian volunteer corps, which looked pretty obviously led by essentially neo-Nazis. These are people who are Russian, but they are neo-Nazis, self-avowedly speaking. Advanced along in Humvees and Max Pros, which you can only get one place, Ryan. You can't get Max Pro vehicles and armored Humvees nearly that easily. And they only advanced a few kilometers. They never got, I think, to Gryvron. I think they only made it past the first village at best. But they made a huge show of it, meaning they took a lot of pictures, made a lot of videos. There are several Telegram channels that were created that tried to build an entire information operation around this. And they obviously embarrassed the Russian leadership. And this incursion went on for about a day before they withdrew, maybe lost a couple of vehicles ultimately in that operation. And then they've been available for the past week for nothing but interviews, right?
Yeah, it put Russia on the back foot in terms of information operations. It showed that Ukraine and perhaps supported forces has the ability to go into Russia should they choose at different places. Should we expect to see more operations of this type, or was this really just meant as part of this, as you alluded to, sort of shaping operations in advance of the offensive?
I think we shouldn't. I think this operation probably had 2 objectives. The first one is a standing political objective, which is one of the driving factors behind Ukrainian attacks in Russia, which is to show that Russia is not invulnerable, to bring the war to Russia, and to do injury to the mythos of kind of Russian power. And the second, I think, is more practical on the military end, which is to get Russian forces to take seriously the problem of defending their border, understanding that Russia doesn't have enough manpower, probably even for the lines that they're currently trying to hold in Ukraine, and try to focus Russian attention on the cross-border threat and trying to get them to commit resources there and perhaps pull them from somewhere else. And from that perspective, these kind of raids are tactically, they're very low cost relative to strategic impact. And you can see that Ukraine is very good at information operations, right? There's there's a lot more information on operation here than there is actual operation. If you just looked at it, and I looked at it with several folks who do OSINT, and they didn't see these guys getting particularly far into Russia. It looked like they got in and they got out pretty fast. And they've been telling a story for about a week for something.
Yeah, but as you know, as you'll agree, this is the point of war. War is a political, an exercise of the political. And to the extent that this was a serious, ground holding raid or not is sort of irrelevant to the political goal of the operation.
Yeah, I think they've done a great job embarrassing.
Do you think there's a risk, though, of Ukraine potentially partnering with such a extreme ideological force?
Look, everyone's welcome to their own opinion on this. Some folks will say this is a war and Ukraine can't pick their proxies, right? And somebody else might say, you know what? Russian leadership had spent all these years claiming there's Nazism in Ukraine and justifying their invasion that way, and so finally the result they had is there are genuinely, Nazis attacking the Russian border, and this is the sort of insecurity they achieved. My own view is that I understand the purpose of the operation, but I find the people being involved in this is probably long-term unhelpful to Ukraine's cause.
To me, it reminds me. I mean, major wars force states to make suboptimal choices. And just picking a war that is most prominent in the American imagination, World War II. If you look at some of the people that the U.S. and its allies had to work with to achieve victory, and not least including Joe Stalin, you don't always get to pick your friends in an existential fight. So I think it's forgivable, although I also worry about the longer-term consequences.
Yeah, so I subscribe to that mindset with one big caveat. I think the thrust of Western support for Ukraine is that Ukraine is a lot better than Russia from a values perspective, okay? And I think that Ukrainian leadership should be cautious not to do injury to the overall perception of that difference.
Especially as support for Ukraine becomes more politically contestable in Washington, for better, for worse, and for worse, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think these are all valid points, and the question is this going to take off, and are we going to see more operations like that? And if we are, then we're probably going to see more questions asked about who these people are and what their goals are.
So let's revisit the debate over Bakhmut, whether this was a wise place for Zelensky and Ukrainian forces to stand their ground despite the costs, or was it a good idea? Was it a bad idea? Was it worth it? Was it not worth it? It's definitely still too soon to tell, but where do you come down? Has your view changed on this?
That's a great question. So first, I definitely think it's too early, and history will be the judge, and probably this will be debated by military historians for a long time. And the effect of a battle, very difficult to assess barely a few days after it ends. My own view is that I actually haven't changed my mind about pretty much any of it based on the way I saw the course of the war, what I saw in Bakhmut, and my interpretation. I think that it was very much Ukraine's choice to make, that military strategy is political, and that the main driver for this battle at the end of the day was political symbology and a contest of wills, those playing out between Russia and Ukraine, and that Bakhmut was a battle that was advantageous, although it wasn't particularly strategically significant, and that over time, as we got into January, became a battle that wasn't particularly advantageous to Ukraine from a military perspective, but became subject to a sunk cost fallacy, as often happens in war, and became politically important and politically significant. And once that became the case, whatever the military rationale is, and military analysts can debate this till the cows come home, it didn't really matter all that much. It didn't figure that much. All right. My own view is that this battle was the longest running battle in the war, but in terms of setting up the Ukraine's upcoming offensive was probably by far the less important. Okay, the key forces that the Russian military would have used to defend against that operation weren't fighting at Bakhmut. It's not going to affect the main entrenchments or preparatory lines of the Russian military, whether it's in the south or in the east in Luhansk. I also think that although the battle was very costly for both Russian forces, particularly Wagner, it was also rather costly for Ukrainian forces fighting in it. However, those costs may not be visible in this upcoming offensive because this operation will likely be conducted by units that are specifically set aside for it. The big question is whether or not we'll see the implications for both sides of this battle after the summer, right, where the sort of Western package is used up, the artillery ammunition is used up, and then both sides are forced to take stock of where they are and what their prospects are heading into the winter. As I wrote recently in Foreign Affairs with Rob Lee, really have to think beyond the offensive and get out short-termism and understand that even if it's incredibly successful, this offensive will not necessarily end the war. And what follows the offensive could be many more months of prolonged attritional fighting because it will take time to build another Western assistance package, to get more artillery ammunition. And so it's really incumbent not to take a wait-and-see approach to this operation, right? But rather to assume that this is going to be a war that goes on well into 2024. It's going to be a long war. And even if the offensive, let's say hypothetically, liberates all Ukrainian territory currently occupied, the war can continue as a cross-border war of attrition, which this raid in Belgorod just showed. Okay, so it doesn't just end there. Anyway, going back to Bakhmut, I thought that unfortunately the battle became subject to sort of interpretations of how the war is going and who's winning, that it became a proxy in positions rather than the subject of great analytical debate. And my sense of it remains that Bakhmut, the city in of itself, was not in a particularly advantageous position to defend. The rate of attrition on both sides was favorable to Ukraine, but not so substantially favorable, and there were some pretty bad months during that fight. The bulk of the forces lost on the Russian side were Wagner, and the majority of those are convicts, and I think they hold far less value. They're not people taken out of the economy. They don't hold political value in terms of cost for the regime. That's fine. And the main Russian forces that were attrition that will be relevant to Ukraine's upcoming operations and the more decisive battles were the ones all that were not Bakhmut that I discussed at the beginning of this podcast. Okay, that said, I totally understand why Ukrainian leadership chose to defend the city. The only I will say is that now they are counterattacking it, and I think the analytical interpretation was that Bakhmut in of itself was not strategically significant, and it is only now that Bakhmut has been lost that the Russian military is deploying forces like the 31st Airborne to hold it, right? While Wagner is beginning to withdraw. And so I think the irony of this battle is that for the past many months, Wagner forces were fighting it largely by themselves with the 106th Airborne supporting them. Only now that they have taken it and they're withdrawing, are Russian forces going to be increasingly fixed to Bakhmut that might be relevant elsewhere, and will find it difficult to defend, meaning they will now find it difficult to defend for the reasons that analysts like myself were saying it was not an easy place to defend in the first place. And so they may not hold on to Bakhmut, and the whole thing may have ended up being for nothing for them down the line.
I want to close with a question about nuclear issues and nuclear threats in particular. This is something that played a prominent role in the conflict in terms of Putin's threats, and now we have the sort of tactical nuclear sharing agreement with Belarus. But aside from that last point, nuclear threats have really taken more of a back seat, it feels like, in the last few months, compared to the few months before that.
Yeah, they have. And I think that sort of the perception of a more acute risk of nuclear escalation that took hold back in October and November has passed and dissipated. That said, just because it's not being talked about, right, doesn't mean that it's not in the back of folks who
it's definitely in the back of everyone's minds.
Yeah. And I thought the question of nuclear escalation in those risks has always been conditions-based. And so the honest answer is that I think it'll come back. I think it'll come back this summer. I'm cautiously optimistic about Ukraine's prospects in this offensive operation. And I think that in the event that they have significant breakthrough, and a breakthrough that doesn't just force a Russian withdrawal the way we saw in Kherson, but can force a rout or a collapse of a front, that we will see nuclear threats, we will see Russian attempts to shape Western thinking to try to slow down Ukraine's operation and to increase the perception of the risk of nuclear escalation, in part because they may be pressed to the point where they would seriously consider it. So I think that while it's not being discussed in public space, the conditions under which it's understood to be a growing risk remain. They haven't changed. We may see some of that. And my view has always been, you have to be cognizant of it and not wish the existence of nuclear weapons away. Whereas I've seen a lot of sort of conversation in the fall, folks gaslighting themselves into believing that tactical nuclear weapons have no practical uses and wouldn't achieve battlefield effects. I disagree with that. But on the other hand, I also haven't seen it particularly deter the United States or other European countries in the sense that, we've largely pressed with providing the capabilities and the training for Ukrainian major offensive operation. And I don't think that, folks have been sort of giving into nuclear blackmail or understanding that if you have the risk of nuclear escalation be such a significant factor, then you're teaching a lot of states that are observing this war something very important, which is essentially that they can start a conventional war, invade a neighbor, and if it goes terribly for them, they can threaten the risk of nuclear escalation, and then you'll largely back down, or at least you'll take steps to ensure that they get something out of it that's not a victory, but not necessarily a defeat either. And I don't think the United States wants to teach Russia or other countries that lesson.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Check out our membership program, in which Mike, of course, plays a prominent role with his show, The Russia Contingency. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and stay healthy.